I have a question of the day. I want to know what you are currently reading and what books are on your TBR. Hello. Welcome to Vlogmas Day 14. I have not vlogged at all today. It's already 3:20 in the afternoon. But I really wanted to talk about all of the books that I've read this year. And so since I haven't done anything else today, I figured now would be the perfect time. So that's what we're going to be doing today. So if you don't like or you don't care to talk about books, then go somewhere else. So one thing that's different for me this year from previous years is that I actually read a lot on my Kindle this year. This was the first year that I actually utilized having one because normally I prefer to have an actual physical book. I kind of got rid of my disdain for e-readers. And so this year I don't have a lot of the physical copies of the books that I read because I read a lot of them on my Kindle. So I will try to insert a picture of the book I'm talking about if I don't actually have it. Most of the ones I have, I read the physical book even if I don't have it with me. Like there's a couple on here that I don't have them, but I did read a physical book. I'm talking too much. Let's get into it. So at the end of 2022, I really got into reading Taylor Jenkins Reid, which I never know if I'm saying her name right. It just sounds weird coming out of my mouth, but I really got into reading her books, preferably, and maybe this is an unpopular opinion, but I really, really, really love her back catalog. So all of the books she wrote before she got into like Daisy Jones, Evelyn Hugo, Carrie Soto. I read After I Do at the end of last year, which is one of my favorite books by this particular author. That inspired me to read more of her back catalog, and I picked up One True Loves. This one wasn't my favorite of all of her books, but it was still really good. Written super well, characters seemed pretty realistic, which is, I think, one thing that people really like about this author is that all of her characters, even when she writes celebrities, which not this book, but just in general, even when she writes celebrities, her books or her characters still feel like real people, which can be a struggle for a lot of authors. But so I really enjoyed this one. Again, not my favorite. I think I gave it, I wish I could see what I gave it. Of course, it's not gonna load now that I'm talking about it. I think this one was a 4 out of 5, so recommend it. The next book that I read was Carrie Soto is Back by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and I really also enjoyed this one. So I gave Carrie Soto a 5 out of 5. I really enjoyed this one. I know some people had mixed feelings about it. I think the biggest complaint about it is that it was very heavy on the tennis, which none of her other books, even when they are focused on a particular subject, a lot of her books don't like solely focus on that, if that makes sense. Like the characters' jobs and stuff are typically just, they'll talk about it, but it's not like the biggest focus. Whereas with Carrie Soto, tennis was a super big part of her character, and so there were a lot of in-depth descriptions of tennis matches. I felt like the descriptions of the tennis matches were super important to the story and Carrie Soto's character development. I just felt like you could see her frustrations growing, you could see her character building, and you could kind of see kind of all the pieces fall into place through these tennis matches. I would say it didn't take away from the story, but if you're like anti-tennis, then maybe you won't like this book because there's a lot of tennis in it. It's just my personal opinion. So after I read Carrie Soto, then I started to venture into memoirs, and the first memoir I picked up was From Scratch by Tembi Locke. Now, I gave this book a 5 out of 5, but the reason I gave it a 5 out of 5 is honestly because I don't like the concept of rating memoirs, which I know on Goodreads you can put like no rating or something whenever you finish a book, but I still like to give it a rating. It makes me feel like I finished the book, if that makes sense. So I gave this one a 5 out of 5, but in terms of, like, if this wasn't a memoir and this was just a fictional story, I don't think I would have liked it as much, just because it is so long and so emotionally draining. Like, I cried like 15 pages into the book, and then I was trauma bonded to the characters, or not characters, real people, but it was written very beautifully. It just was very long and very emotionally draining, like I've already said. So I will say, if you are a fan of Italian food, this book takes place in Sicily, and in the very back of the book, the author includes recipes because her husband was a chef, and that part, real fun. I enjoyed reading about the food, but if you're not in a place where you can be emotionally scarred just from like pain and having to read hundreds of pages of grief and mourning, then this probably isn't for you. But it is a good read. It's just long, but beautiful, if that means anything. But yeah, I gave this one a 5 out of 5 because I don't like to rate memoirs, but it was a beautiful story. Like the story, 5 out of 5. But I don't know. It really, take that for what you will. I don't know. I don't even know what I'm saying. After I read that memoir, I needed a break from memoirs. I started to buy a bunch of them and add them to my TBRs, but I had to take a break because that was so long. And then I got into thrillers. If you didn't know, if you're ever in a reading slump, pick up a good thriller, because a good thriller will get you out of that reading slump so fast. And so I picked up The Guest List by Lucy Foley, which I had the physical copy of. I don't know where it is, but I read the physical copy of this one. This wasn't the greatest thriller I've ever read in my life. I've read better ones. But it was fast paced. I read it in like 2 sittings. I will say I've heard very mixed reviews about Lucy Foley as an author, which I kind of agree with. Like, while it's fast paced, it's also, I predicted the ending pretty early on, and so it kind of spoiled the plot twist. It was written all right, but it just wasn't my favorite. I don't know. I gave it a 2. I gave it a 2 out of 5 because I guess the ending, and there were a lot of things in there that were very triggering, and I'm not one to like require books to display trigger warnings right off the bat. I do think they can be helpful, but I just felt like a lot of the things that were included in the book that should have required a trigger warning, I felt like they came out of nowhere and were not very important to the overall plot. And so it kind of just felt like some of the things that were in there were there for shock value and less for character development, if that makes sense. Yeah, I gave it a 2 out of 5. Honestly, the characters are not very likable. And for me, if I'm reading a thriller, especially if like there's a murder or whatever it is that's taking place, like I want to care about the characters enough to like invest in what happens to them, and I just did not feel invested in this story. And then of course I guess the plot twist, and just 2 out of 5. My love for thrillers did not die after reading that one, because then I entered my Thursday Murder Club binge. If you've never read Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman, you are missing out severely. There's 4 books in the series. I've read the first 3. I have not read the very last one, but it starts with Thursday Murder Club, and then after that is The Man Who Died Twice, and then The Bullet That Missed, and I, for the life of me, do not know the name of the 4th one because I have not read it, but the first 3 are amazing. I will say, if you're in the mood for like a cozy murder mystery, Clue-esque thriller, these are definitely great choices for you. The main characters are older men and women who live in a retirement home, who are just kind of bored with the mundane life that they live, and so they start solving crimes that are occurring around them. And I just think this author is the only male author I've ever read from who like nails all of his characters. Like normally when I read, especially women who are written by men, it never goes well in my opinion, but this author does a really good job. I don't know, the characters, there's 4 main characters. They're all super lovable and quirky and hilarious because of course. And I think if you are in the mood for an easy and enjoyable and cozy read, but you also want to invest yourself in storylines and characters, then this series is for you. I will also say the first book, The Thursday Murder Club, it is slightly slow just because you are being introduced to the world that is being written about. But then the second book, The Man Who Died Twice, goes by really fast. The Bullet That Missed goes by really fast. I gave the first two, I think I gave 5 stars. The third one I gave 4 stars just because it wasn't my personal favorite, but it was still really good. Highly recommend. Highly recommend. And I read all 3 on my Kindle, so that's why they're not in this video with me. And then after that, I finally picked up A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson. I read all 3 books in the series. The first book had been on my TBR for about 6 months. My friend Aya was trying really hard to convince me to read it because she also convinced me to read Thursday Murder Club. She also convinced me to read Akatar last year. Most of my favorite books have been recommendations from my friend Aya, so if you ever need book recommendations, just ask Aya and she will hook you up. But A Good Girl's Guide to Murder, I gave all 3 books a 5-star. I'm almost positive. Okay, I gave the first one a 4-star, and then I think I gave, I want to say, oh, I gave them all 4 stars. Just kidding. I gave them all 4 stars, but they were all really great, and I just think some of it was a little young for me, and then some of it was a little much for me, if that makes sense. Like, it never felt perfectly right there in the middle where I wanted it. But overall, all 3 books were great reads and I really enjoyed them. The first one I read the physical copy. The last 2 I read on my Kindle. So I don't know where the first one is either, but I don't have the second 2. After that, I picked up 5 Survive by the same author, Holly Jackson. As you know, I have not read much this year, so the Good Girl's Guide to Murder series I read back in May, and then this one I picked up a couple days ago. This one I didn't love as much as A Good Girl's Guide to Murder, but it was still pretty good. I just didn't particularly care about the characters. I still gave it, I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. The writing was pretty good, and I was very intrigued by the story overall, but the characters I just didn't have any particular desire for. I did take the sleeve off because I prefer taking the sleeves off, but that's really all I have to say about this book. I don't know, it just didn't stick out to me. But fast-paced read, read it in 2 sittings, if that means anything to you. So there was 5 Survive. And then the last book that I read, I actually started a couple of months ago and I just had to put away because it was very heavy, and I have been slowly reading it ever since, and I finally finished it yesterday actually. And that is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. If you don't know who this author is, this author was actually the victim of Brock Turner. If you don't know anything about the story, I recommend reading this book to learn more, just because one of the biggest parts about this book is that she talks about how the media and the world have kind of taken her story away from her. And because her identity was anonymous for so long, that kind of made it easy for the media to do that. And so this was kind of her way of like reclaiming her story in a way. But it's just a very powerful read. I will say heavy, heavy, heavy on the trigger warnings because she does talk about what happened to her in a very honest and raw way, which is important, but at the same time, I understand can be very triggering for people. And so if that is too much for you, then don't pick it up. But I will say this story is very important, and at the very least, you could read her victim impact statement, which is in the back of the book. It's the last thing she includes, but you could also find it. It was published on BuzzFeed shortly after the trial. But the story was beautiful and sad and frustrating and angering. You see, I actually started annotating and I had to stop about a quarter of the way in because all of my tabs would have been red or blue because I was getting very angry and very sad. So I had to stop annotating it. I gave this one a 5 out of 5, not just because it's a memoir, but also because it was written beautifully. And there were many, 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 many times throughout the entire book that I teared up or almost started fully sobbing and had to kind of like collect myself. But yeah, I do recommend it. Like I said, look up the trigger warnings. That's all I really have to say because I think you should just read it for yourself to fully understand what I'm talking about when I say that this book is amazing. But yeah, so those are all the books I've read this year. As you can tell, I have not read a lot. My goal for this year was to read 30 books and I have read 12. and I think I talked about all of them. We'll see if I can read 18 books in the next 18 days. I don't know what my goal for 2024 is going to be, but I think it's going to be lower because I know that I'm going to be busy. So I can't wait to see what you guys are currently reading and what's on your TBR. Also, let me know how many books are on your 2023 reading challenge goal, because I want to know. I feel like 30 books is not a lot, and I feel like I got very close to accomplishing, if not fully accomplishing, my goals in the past years. And then this year I just totally failed. So maybe I'm crazy. I don't know. Anyway, this is a 21-minute long clip of me talking about 12 books. Can't wait to edit that. Okay.